Greetings. This is a short little video that is a spin-off of a video of my good friend Nelson Walters on Daniel in the Lion's Den and the Horns of the Wild Ox. Now, in his video on Daniel in the Lion's Den, Nelson Walters compares that to Jesus on the cross and then being placed in the tomb. And in the video, he has 13 parallels which compare Daniel being in the lion's den and Jesus in the tomb. And I think you'd find it very interesting. It's teaching that I hadn't heard before, and I think it's right on. And if you haven't seen that video, either click on, or if you can't do that, copy and paste the hyperlink here in this slide and watch his video and see what you think. I think you'll find it to be very interesting and provocative. Now, in the video, Nelson points out that contained within the crucifixion psalm, which is Psalm 22, in verse 21, David states, "Save me from the lion's mouth." And he correlated this to Daniel being saved from the mouths of the lions in the lion's den, which is a very interesting observation. I would like to comment further on the second half of verse 21, which speaks of the horns of the wild ox. Now, Nelson was astute to point out that Daniel in the lion's den, that the den was closed with a stone and then sealed with the king's seal, much in the same way that when Jesus was crucified, he was placed in the tomb, and the tomb was blocked with a stone and sealed with a seal. Now, if Daniel was saved from the lion's mouth while he was in the lion's den, what about the second half of the verse where he is answered from the horns of the wild ox? In the celestial sky, the horns of the wild ox refers to the horns of Taurus, as depicted here. Now, the Hebrew word for bull is shur, S-H-U-R, which also is a Hebrew root word which can have various meanings, including to return, to rule, and to judge. We also know that the ancient Hebrews referred to the planet Jupiter as ZEDEK, referring to the Messiah star, Messiah planet, and the name they used for Jupiter was ZEDEK, which means righteousness. So it's interesting then that we can observe ZEDEK or Jupiter in the horns of the wild ox, and there are different times during history that we can observe this alignment. In our videos on the 70th week of Daniel, we've postulated a hypothesis that the 70th week of Daniel runs from 2017 to 2024. And it turns out that on the proposed day 1290 of this hypothesis, which would fall on Yom Kippur, or Day of Atonement, on the 12th of October 2024, we find that Jupiter, or ZEDEK, has returned to the horns of the wild ox, and signifying the return of the judge who is going to rule and to reign. Then moving on further, on day 1335, which would fall on the 26th of November 2024, and this is 1335 days from the proposed abomination of desolation on the 1st of April 2021, we find that on this particular day that ZEDEK, or Jupiter, is smack in the middle of the horns of the wild ox, as shown here. And then furthermore, if we understand again that Psalm 22 is the crucifixion psalm, we notice that David cries out that from the horns of the wild oxen thou dost answer me. And we find that on the 14th of April of 32 AD, which actually corresponds to the 14th of Nisan, 32 AD, we find that ZEDEK is smack in the middle of the horns of the wild ox once again. as shown in this picture. And so we find that on our proposed crucifixion day, indeed, Jesus on the cross was answered from the horns of the wild ox, with Jupiter smack in the middle of the horns. And then also on the day 1335 in 2024, at the end of the 70th week, we find that Jupiter has returned to the horns of the wild ox to rule and reign. So in the first instance, Messiah is ruling over sin and death by the work that he performed on the cross. And then we find that at the end of the 70th week, he has returned to rule and reign in preparation for the millennial kingdom in 2024. These things we've covered in our videos on Daniel's 70th week. So what do these have to do with the story of Daniel in the lion's den? Well, as we have heard from Nelson, he's postulated that Daniel in the lion's den was a foreshadowing of Christ's crucifixion and his placement in the tomb. So let's see if we can uncover any celestial alignments that might support this. We know that Babylon fell in October of 539 BC, and Darius the Mede then assumed the rule of Babylon. He appointed leaders or satraps to govern the various provinces of Babylon, and Daniel was considered in high regard, so he was placed as head over these various leaders. This caused Daniel's cohorts to be jealous, and so they plotted against him. They were his enemies, and they plotted to have him thrown into the lion's den. And so this very likely happened shortly after Darius the Mede assumed leadership of Babylon. And so the question then is, where was ZEDEK at that time in the fall of 539 BC? And so what we find on the anniversary of day 1335 in the year 2024, we can go to 26 November 539 BC, which is roughly a month or two after the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians, and we find that once again, ZEDEK is smack in the middle of the horns of the wild ox. And so we could say then that not only was Daniel saved from the lion's mouth, he was also answered from the horns of the wild ox, as Jesus was on crucifixion day in 32 AD. So we find that, in fact, that Nelson Walter's proposal that Daniel in the lion's den is a foreshadowing of Jesus when he was crucified and then placed in the tomb, we find that, in fact, the celestial alignment supports this teaching. And we can see that Daniel indeed was saved from the lion's mouth, and that ZEDEK was in the middle of the horns of the wild ox, just as it was on crucifixion day, and also as it will appear on day 1335 in the year 2024, if our hypothesis is correct. And so this celestial alignment would be supportive of the idea that Nelson has proposed, which it would be a shadow of Yeshua in the tomb. Shalom. The Lord Almighty, He is sovereign, and He is in complete control of His celestial clock. And the more of these stones that we uncover that align as we would have expected, this just increases the credence that I would give to the moving objects in the skies as the moving hands of God's celestial clock to tell us what time we are in, prophetically speaking. Shalom and good evening.